Okay, so today we are back with our founders, Marianne Edain and Steve Erickson, to discuss the Forest Practices Act and how its rules relate to enforcement in Island County. But first, before we get into that, I think it's really important for us to talk about the history of logging in Washington state and how that has shaped the landscape and laws around the way we treat our forests. So I guess where I kind of want to start, because Marianne, you and I have started this conversation a bunch of times, and every time we start basically with the very first logger in Washington state. And so I really want to ask you, like, how did logging start in our region, and what did it first look like?
Okay, so way back when explorers were moving along the Washington coast and beginning to discover Puget Sound and discovering very big trees, many of them, most of our coasts are coastal bluffs. Mm-hmm. And that made it easy for people who wanted those big trees to climb up the bluff and take their very large saws. These obviously are hand saws. We're talking the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And it would take, people have seen the photos of, 7 men standing in the notch of a tree. Mm-hmm. It would take a lot of men, a lot of time. So they took the biggest and the best, and they took the ones right on the edge of the bluff, because then they could knock them down. So they went over the bluff and into the water.
Mm-hmm. So that was, back in the day, in the 1800s ish.
Yeah, 1890s, before the 1890s, really.
Before the 1890s, it was really labor intensive, person intensive, and the scope was limited by how far you could transport these trees and how much energy it took to fell one tree, basically.
And somebody got the idea of, well, let's just take them down the rivers and the streams. Mm-hmm. So to do that, they would dam up a stream, drop all the trees into the river or stream there, mm-hmm, with a big dam, and then just blow out the dam. For example, with dynamite, creating this massive, basically pile of logs rushing downstream to the main river where they could be floated to the mill or out into Puget Sound as a log raft to be towed elsewhere, generally California, or to a bigger mill somewhere else in Puget Sound. This, you can imagine the effect this had on stream ecology and river ecology.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
back up a little bit, pre-settlement. Now, the rivers were full of log jams. Mm-hmm. Puget had millions of logs floating in it, and these affected stream and ocean ecology all the way out into the mid-Pacific. There were whole suites of organisms, mm-hmm, and fish that would congregate under those log rafts, those floating log rafts. Once navigation got going, of course, the log rafts were an impediment, and there were even bounties to remove logs in Puget Sound. If a log was floating anywhere in the Sound, you could just take it. So that was an initial large impact to the ecosystem. That's usually glossed over. Then came steam donkeys, yeah. Steam donkeys were basically a motorized device powered by wood, a steam engine powered by wood, because that was what they had, and it was all over the place. And it's basically just a winch. Big one. So, here we've got this log that's now, and they began building railroads too, logging railroads, and there actually was one of those up Glendale Creek on South Whidbey.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So now you could start dropping trees further away from that means to really move them. easily and use these giant winches, these steam donkeys, to pull them to the railroad or to the stream where with the splash dam or to the river or to the coast. And of course, again, this created enormous scarring of the ground, amounts of erosion, enormous soil disturbance for exotic species to move into. It was basically mining.
Mining, like tree mining. And this is like turn of the century tree mining. Where are we at?
Donkeys started coming in 1890s, maybe a little bit, and kept being in use until the gasoline engines came in. Now we started having, besides using the old crosscut saws, these great big hand saws with one guy on both ends. Now we started seeing logging getting more efficient with chainsaws that powered by gas. So there were some early attempts to do steam-powered chainsaws. Kind of a pain, but they did speed it up a little bit, but it was a big deal. So early chainsaws were these huge, heavy contraptions. A lot of them took 2 people to use. Of course, big too. But now, we've got, keep going to the modern era, and we have these lightweight saws where one person can fell a 12-foot diameter tree.
Right. So in this whole evolution of tools, right? Because it's like logging started with, more rudimentary saw tools and shorter transportation scope just because of the nature of those tools. And over, during the Industrial Revolution, basically there all of these kind of tools and our use of natural resources created an opportunity for people to fell trees and travel them across greater distances. Where were these in Washington State? Like, where were these trees going and for what?
Initially, down the coast of California, San Francisco, gold rust. Then for shipbuilding, shipbuilding in California too, and shipbuilding up here a little bit. That's what happened to the straighter Oaks and Oak Harbor. People settled Oak Harbor initially did shipbuilding, and that lasted for like maybe a decade or two before they used up all the straight oak. Like that. This was just mining. I mean, our European ancestors, regional ancestors, if you will, by and large were a rapacious bunch of use it up as fast as possible and profit off it. Miners,
Okay, but then
now getting back to technology here, moving these huge logs to market got easier and easier once they were gasoline engines, and you started having catlogging bulldozers pulling them. Okay, again, compressing the ground with the bulldozers and then gouging the hell out of it with a tree you're dragging along it. So again, huge amounts of disturbance. Now, where let me just get back in here into a little bit of the kind of the national legal complexion of this. When the West was first being settled by Euro-Americans, our esteemed legislators in Congress, there were really 2 things going on with them. One, they were all on the take. Parts. That was how people got to build intercontinental railroads, is they went and bought enough senators to give them the concession. Okay. This happened with industry after industry. So you had the transcontinental railroads, and with those on the northern ones, the Northern Pacific, every other section on each side of the track, section is a square mile,
okay,
was given to the railroad. the idea was the railroad would sell these. These would be hardworking yeoman farmers who would clear the land. And as they had in the Midwest, moving the trees back to the railroad with a team of oxen, which might work for, some puny 3-foot diameter maple or something, but wasn't going to work for a 10-foot diameter Douglas fir. That's too long. So there was that problem too. And of course, the land was awful for farming. And this theme runs throughout the history of the Northwest. And you can really see it on Whidbey, all kinds of pamphlets in the early 1900s about Whidbey Island, world beater, telling people that look at the size of these trees, clear those trees, imagine the crop of wheat you can get out of the land. Just, absolute nonsense. So you have a lot of these people, get their 40 acres or their 160 acres. It's not enough to be able to, have an organized crew that you need to move these giant trees and transport them and all that. It's just going to be done by a yeoman farmer and his extended family with a team of oxen. That was just not going to happen. So all that land went into ownership of timber giants, timber barons. For example, George Weyerhaeuser, who had basically logged out all of his extensive holdings in the Midwest and became friends with James Hill, the railroad baron, the Northern Pacific, and, got James Hill to give him the logging concessions on these lands. And that's where Weyerhaeuser came from. The huge giant, huge timber giant, or now the huge real estate investment trust.
Oh, so Weyerhaeuser is now a real estate investment trust, but started as
all the big timber companies are. They got Congress to pass some really nice tax code amendments, so they all changed into real estate investment trusts that made a lot more money and saved them a pile of money on federal taxes.
It also speaks to the clearing and grading development pipeline, right? To go from having the land with the natural resource on it, mining that natural resource, and then converting that land.
That progress, we start with untouched land where nobody ever lived before. Here, get those natives out of here. Nobody ever lived there before, right? Get them out of here for being pestiferous. And then, take as much as you can. Let's do fish traps right at the mouth of all the rivers where the salmon have to come in. Let's just strip all those trees. Okay, now we sell it to these idiot farmers from back east who think they're moving to paradise. Are they not? Okay, and of course they'll keep breeding and making more people, and eventually it'll all be cities with maybe some farms here and there or something, but it's always this continual pipeline or transformation of the land from the wilderness, the dreaded wilderness, appeared to something nice and manicured. You can sort of see this in modern forestry, at least as it is really typically practiced. And you'll see this a lot with the courses that WSU Co-op Extension has for small forest landowners. They're really taught, and it's inculcated in them, that no forest ever amounted to anything if it wasn't managed.
Right, that an unmanaged forest is an unsuccessful forest. Is that?
It's kind of like rain follows the plow. Okay. It's a statement of existence. All the universe. So I once sat on a negotiating panel, and I'm trying to remember what it was something with forestry, but there was this one guy there who was a logger, a tree farmer, quote unquote. He had like 30,000 acres or something, small scale as these things go, really. in Washington or Oregon. And at one point, he allowed as no forest ever amount to anything unless it was managed. And I turned to him and I said, "Oh, so you don't think we should cut old growth anymore?" And he stared at me for a long time.
Yeah. Well, old growth is interesting. What'd you say?
So it's being taught people. So that is the basis in which they undertake forest management. That's the psychological and conceptual basis, as opposed to, which is not to say, given current conditions, not doing anything is always a viable option, but it's sort of off the table to start with.
Right. Well, the human manipulation of land is required and necessary, is the underpinning of it. And it seems like, historically speaking, Washington State, from a colonizer and pioneering lens, has its roots in mining the land for its resources, and one of its major resources being its trees.
Yeah, and in fact, there was one newspaper article I came across online once from Whidbey Island in the 1930s. That was a letter to the editor that talked about how, all the trees were going to be cut down and the reasons why that wasn't a good idea, et cetera. And so even back then, there were people who could see that, where this was going. Mm-hmm. That's why today, you take that mentality writ large, and that's why today we're in the mess we're in overall. So
right. And Whidbey Island itself, a very large portion of it was cleared, right, at the turn of the century. Like,
yes,
Radiations, the first bit.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little. So the first loggers, the first times they cut, they took the easy stuff. Those guys on the bluffs who were dropping trees in the Puget Sound to be cut up into firewood for the steamers, the steam ships, they didn't go for the 10-foot diameter trees, the 8-foot diameter trees, the 6-foot diameter trees. And for the small ones, they were easier to deal with. Okay. And even later, there was a lot of high grading. If a tree had a defect, quote unquote, in terms of timber value, then why bother? There's an infinite amount out there. And in fact, in the 1950s, I saw a 1950s little pamphlet from the Washington Cedar Shake Association talking about cedar shakes were the greatest form of roofing, and there's an inexhaustible supply. We will never run out. It's a long time since I've seen a tree that wasn't in a protected area, that cedar tree that was suitable for making shakes out of. Okay.
What's a shake?
Those roofing things you see sometimes on old places.
Shingles.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Shingles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there are a couple of things here. One is that initially high grading was typical. Okay, it's really only after you get into after World War II and on the island, on Whidbey Island, really in the 1980s and 90s, really, that you started getting into the real total clear cut level at all. For a while, the Forest Service was really in what they called YUM, yarding unmerchantable material. That meant that, even if there was a tree there that was, not merchantable, had defect, it was forked, something, had rot in it, it would be dropped and it would all be bulldozed into a big pile and burnt. Okay. So that was a common industrial forestry practice, getting up into the really 1990s, 1980s, 80s, really, I'd say. Now, the small scale kind of logging that happened on the island, you can see a couple distinct phases. One is that really sloppy, opportunistic logging that was done at the start. got into, well, it's opportunistic, but we're also going for the big ones because they're worth a bunch of money. But even so, you'd have stands left that still had a lot of trees standing. You had snags. You had a lot of downed woody debris, which is really crucial for ecosystem functioning. All reasons that I won't get into here. But and the so-called legacy forests, the legacy forest movement now, they keep DNR from cutting those kind of forests, dating really from before World War II mostly, from logging those now, because those have regenerated with a lot of characteristics typical of ancient forest stands. They got multi-layered canopies. They still have large woody debris in them. That was really common on Whidbey, right into the 70s, even 80s, somewhat 90s, but less so. And of course, now you get we turn everything into a plantation. We leave the number of trees that we're required to by law that we have to leave because those damn environmentalists and bird watchers said you got to leave 3 green trees, 3 snags,
3 standing green trees, 2 standing snags, and 2 down logs per acre.
3 standing green trees, 2 standing snags, and 3 green logs per acre. And of course, generally they blow down.
Right.
Anyway, it doesn't come anywhere near the levels of retained large woody debris that you see in natural forests. And, and those logs are so much smaller than the big old growth logs now, because you're into 2nd and 3rd generation. And the rotation age, the age that they're cut, keeps getting shorter and shorter, that they rot much, much faster than a really big log.
So
that's the other trend that's happening here. Originally, of course, people didn't think in terms of rotation or replanting or anything. In those sloppily log stands, generally, natural regeneration was often quite fine, worked quite well. You ended up with a stand that was, very diverse in terms of species, in terms of the canopy layers, in terms of its structure, its physical structure. Again, really important for wildlife. Then, it was noticed that places weren't being replanted. And as they got into clearing more and more, we have to actually replant. We're going to be efficient and industrial. So it was, replanting anywhere from, currently it's 200 trees per acre to 600 trees per acre was where that all kind of started back after World War II. And of course, we want it to be easy to harvest and everything. So we put them in nice rows at fixed distance apart. Of course, on sloping ground, that kind of goes away after a while. The spacing gets mixed up. But on flat ground, you have these plantations that they are really dull and boring. They're dull and boring to look in, to live in. They produce crappy wood. And they're not just dull and boring for wildlife, they are deserts for wildlife.
Right. Well, it's monocropping.
It's monocropping. And it's monocropping in a way that, think about a farmer who's got somewhat sloping ground, like in the Dust Bowl, okay? We finally stopped the Dust Bowl in the 30s was the new USDA Soil Conservation Service. Their main person in the heart of the Dust Bowl in the Texas-Oklahoma Panhandle region figured out that with his experiments, all you had to do to stop the winds from blowing the soil away is plant on the contour. A slight slope, just plant on the contour instead of straight across everything. And that was enough. So, even simple things like that have typically been ignored in forestry. And the only reason this has become an issue really is a few things. One, the growth of environmentalism and the laws accompanying that, and the increasing legal power of the native peoples.
Awareness of
and the scientific awareness too, much of which in the Northwest has to be traced directly to Dr. Jerry Franklin, now emeritus professor at University of Washington, who in the 1970s, the United Nations declared an international, it's going to be the year of ecosystems, and every place around the world every region was going to select their, main ecosystem and study it. And Jerry was a research forester with the USDA, with Forest Service. Got together with some of his other research foresters, and they looked at old growth, the ancient forests of the Northwest, and they said, we don't really know anything about these. Everybody always says they're biological deserts because there's, deer don't hang out in them.
Yeah.
But how do they actually function? So, and it's interesting, the very first thing they did was in their first studies was they produced a carbon budget. How much carbon is in the forest? How much is in the standing trees and the limbs and the needles? How much is on the ground and this downwoody debris? How much is in the soil? And, research that now is, just happening with other ecosystems around the world. And that's kind of interesting because nobody was talking about climate change then.
It is interesting. That's one of the first things that they studied. I'm also, for people listening, what constitutes a forest as old growth forest?
Interesting question. Okay. So this was kind of a conundrum. It's kind of one of those things that what it is when you see it, maybe. And so this became a very big question. This went from being just an ecological question to being a political and legal question with the timber wars in the 1980s. And the push to get protection for the spotted owl as an umbrella species for the ancient forest ecosystem. Coincidentally, while Jerry Franklin and Norm Johnson and various others research foresters were studying ancient forests and figuring out how they worked, how they functioned, a young guy named Eric Forsman got really intrigued by this really cryptic bird, this owl that, there were like a few reports in the literature of, and it just said lives in old forests. And so he started studying it, and he found it was totally dependent on ancient forest. It had low population densities. It had all the characteristics that make it really vulnerable to extinction.
This is the spotted owl we're talking about?
Talking about the spotted owl. So he just, that became his career, doing censuses and other things on spotted owls. That provided, and so in the late 1980s, a guy who was a former timber industry lobbyist named Anthony Dahl down in Oregon came up with a strategy to protect ancient forests, which the National Wildlife Federation wanted to do, and Air Club Legal Defense Foundation, which eventually became Earth Justice.
Cool.
Finally put an office up and some lawyers up there for him to work with. And he came up with a strategy of using laws that were already on the books. And the result was court decisions that basically shut down logging in the Northwest on federal lands. The initial response to this was to get a rider on an appropriations bill. Rider is something you tack onto an unrelated must-pass bill, like a defense bill or the budget.
Yeah.
That to do with it. But typically, these are used to get things you can't get done otherwise, like removing wolves in a particular area of the country from the endangered species list. On Wyoming, that's why they're not on the endangered species list anymore. And that's what happened there. Okay. And it caused a huge rift in the environmental community. The Sierra Club, which had gotten pretty corporate by then, took the position that this is the best we can get. Otherwise, we're going to lose the Endangered Species Act entirely. And Earth First and the more radical types all said, no, we need to keep pushing here as hard as we can. This all resulted ultimately in the Northwest Forest Forum, or the Northwest Timber Forum, depending on your point of view, which was a big federal thing, big conference where Bill Clinton, then president, and Al Gore, then VP, came out to the Northwest for a few days for this big conference and heard from all the stakeholders and learned about the science. And there was a lot happening behind the scenes too, like there, at the time, log exports were not at all banned from federal or private lands. Somebody I know who was who was he a lobbyist for? I'm trying to remember. I think National Wildlife, I think it was, went on a small plane ride with Secretary of Agriculture at the time, Mike Estes. I could be wrong on that. And this would have been, 93, 94, I think, and 92. They were going to go look around Mount St. Helens, which, had blown by then. And as they took off, they were going around Longview, Southwest Washington port, huge log exporting port. And, my friend looked out the window and, immediately grabbed the Secretary of Ag and, look out the window. There go the forests of Washington and Oregon,
You could just see that it was bald, or what? Like, what were they seeing?
Huge piles, 20, 30,
piles.
40, covering acres and acres of trees, whole trunks. But it's 20, 40, 60 feet long. And these are huge trees too, a lot of them. So the result was the Northwest Forest Plan, which is currently being revised, which tried to promise something to everybody, but has since basically resulted in not quite a moratorium on logging in the Northwest, but something gets pretty close to it. Certainly in Washington, it totally shifted
on federal, not state.
On federal lands. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So moratorium on logging on federal lands in Washington.
Arguably have increased the pressure on the private and state lands, but they were already pretty much basically just an adjunct of the timber industry. DNR and the Forest Practices Board and those outfits, they've always just basically been an extension of the timber industry. And you can kind of see that in their history. The Washington Forest Practices Act was finally passed in...
The Washington State Legislature passed the Forest Practices Act in 1974.
74.
74.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Before then, logging in Washington had, unless you did something really, really gross and somebody actually saw it, which was unlikely, was basically unregulated.
Unregulated, right. Okay.
So now on Whidbey Island, if we wanted, to back up one more place here, then we'll get to Whidbey. So in Washington State, you had every other section of land on the railroad being given to the state to be used for construction of schools.
Nope, you're wrong.
No, I'm wrong?
Steve is confusing two things. There were the railroad lands, which were every other square mile, up to 20 miles from the proposed railroad right-of-way. But when Washington became a state, the federal government granted to the state 1 square mile out of every 36, and a square mile is known as a section, and the 36 square miles is known as a township. So 1 section out of every township was given to the state for the benefit of the state schools.
Right. Which, and this relates to the Department of Natural Resources, and because they are, well, we'll get to that, but okay.
Yes.
Keep going.
They manage, theoretically, they manage those lands.
Also the reverting.
Okay, and Steve reminds me, something that happened in the 1930s when the economic collapse happened, there were a lot of those yeoman farmers who could not pay the taxes on their land, and those lands reverted back to counties, and counties said, what are we going to do with them? And so they reverted, and DNR manages those lands as well.
Okay. And so that's like, so to go back to, so the Forest Practices Act was passed in 1974. There's this history of logging and mining in Washington state for, just mining the natural resources, which in this case are trees, not only trees, but trees. And the Department of Natural Resources ended up inheriting land from the federal government to benefit school systems, and also inheriting land from, pioneers or yeoman farmers, as you're calling them, who couldn't pay their taxes ultimately.
Right.
In your view, what is the purpose of the Forest Practices Act?
So let me go back to when we did the blockading of the Classic U cut. That was land that was states. It was called Classic U because it was off of Classic Road, and the U was for the university. So it was university trust land. Mm-hmm. And the person in charge of DNR at that time was a man named Bert Cole, and he was the first commissioner of public lands. Mm-hmm. So this was still a very new organization. And as far as DNR was concerned, its business was to facilitate logging as hard and fast as possible to give money to the schools. And that's what it did.
Okay. Is it responsible for any other resource conversion on behalf of any other entities other than school systems?
I'm not sure when, but DNR also theoretically manages shorelines. Mm-hmm. And
leases.
Wait, what?
Aquatic leases.
Yeah, aquatic leases.
And there's also short step.
Okay, so some of the lands, here on the west side, we have forest. Mm-hmm. And the obvious way to generate funds for the schools was to clear cut the forest. Mm-hmm. But there's also one section out of every township on the east side where, you don't have forest necessarily. And it's unclear to me just how DNR manages those lands.
Most agricultural leases.
Okay, Steve is saying mostly ag leases. Mm-hmm. So basically, what can I say? DNR has, over the years, we've been unfortunately familiar with every commissioner of public lands since Bert Cole, has stated, loudly and vociferously that their business is to provide funds for the state schools.
Right.
And at this point, what is it? Conservation Northwest, it's been a year or two ago that they sued DNR and mm-hmm. said that it was misrepresenting or misunderstanding its mandate, mm-hmm. state constitution, no less, mm-hmm. and that state constitution required that DNR provide benefits to all of the people of the state, not just the what are called the trust beneficiaries, the schools. Mm-hmm. And we're not seeing a whole lot of action on that. DNR continues to offer up logging sales.
It's legacy forest.
Yeah. So now there is the legacy forest movement trying to protect the forests that are managed by DNR, and DNR is not abiding by, as far as I can tell, this requirement to benefit all the people of the state. And the superintendent of public instruction has actually put out statements and reports demonstrating that the financial benefits received by those schools are minimal, and that the costs to the people of the state and to our ecosystem are very, very large compared to those minimal financial benefits to the schools.
Yeah, I think I remember reading an article where the amount of funding that school systems were getting was, not a large enough percentage to really be truly impactful on the budget, and the trees that they're taking down in this time of very obvious climate change among other ecosystem, functioning issues it's obviously not benefiting all of us who live here.
I'm not sure who did it, whether it was Conservation Northwest or somebody else, but an economic impact analysis has been done that demonstrates that DNR is losing money for the people of the state.
Wow.
By putting up these timber sales, that the ecological benefits, the carbon sequestration, the provision of oxygen for those of us who like to breathe, things like that, far outweigh the small dollar amount that these school districts get. But it is a political question, and those school districts have their lobbyists, and they demand that they get their money. And one of the big issues on the table right now is, can we find, and where can we find, an alternative source of funding for those school districts and counties and junior taxing districts to avoid having to cut down those trees?
Right, because it's also reasonable that these school districts are relying on funds from DNR. And if they're not going to get it, they do have to, we all have to figure out how to make up for that, because even if we're saying it's not significant in a large sense, I'm sure for each school district it is significant.
Well, it's an interesting question, because specifically it is for capital investment. This is for just running the school. This is for... It's
not operational expenses.
Right.
Oh, interesting. And right. I guess tax dollars go towards operational expenses.
Right.
So, for example, the money can only be used for basically school construction, but they have other needs as well. And even in terms of school construction, the amount that goes to any one district is not enough usually to construct a whole school. So a really bozo system, and it's just time to come up with a different funding stream for those places, those parts of the state that are reliant on this money, other than logging. As for logging in general, of course, DNR also regulates private lands forestry. Frequently, if a wink and a nod, I would say. And we have a lot of similar problems too. Basically, what needs to happen is, and I have to back up here a little bit, because the other trend that's been happening with forestry, quote unquote, is that the age of the trees that are being cut is decreasing. First, it was, basically ancient forest, trees that might be anywhere from 60 or 80 or 100 years old to, hundreds of years, hundreds old. Then, it's gotten shorter and shorter and shorter. Right after World War II, the ideal industrial plantation in the Northwest was going to get logged again when the trees were like maybe 65 or 75 years old. By the 1990s, industry was saying 65 to 55. Lately, they were down to 45 years. Now there's talk of 35-year rotations. because, we could take those trees and make a couple of crappy 2x4s or 2x6s out of them, or maybe just grind them all up and glue them all together with epoxy, glue all the chips together with epoxy. So, there's that whole trend that's going on. And this has had a few results. One is that there really aren't any mills out there anymore that can handle big logs. Mm-hmm. Now, that's good in that it means people aren't going out and cutting big logs down generally, big trees down to take to a mill somewhere, unless it's a very rich high-end consumer, basically. But the downside of this is it's locked us into this shortening cycle where the rotation age gets shorter and shorter and shorter, and that results in truncation of the ecosystem functions of the forest and reducing those ecosystem benefits. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of talk going on now about how can we shift to a longer rotation age, so the trees get bigger and we get the kind of ecological benefits and ecosystem benefits we get out of that. And the general trend seems to be the thinking, at least among, I'll say, the progressive wing of forestry, is that emphasis should be placed on all those plantations that are out there that are overstocked. This is on both state and especially private industrial land too. The private industrial landowners, of course, they don't want to put a lot of money into thinning out these overstocked plantations or creating uneven age stands out of them or any of that, because it costs money and they're not getting much reward for it now. Mm-hmm. The reason they own this land is to make money. And if you can make $10 now, then that means you have $10 you can invest somewhere else. Whereas if you have to spend $10, that means you don't have $10 you can invest somewhere else, there's money to be made in widgets, and you need the money to buy widgets, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, capital's fungible.
Yeah.
So the theory here is, and there's actually an organization called EcoTrust is working on this, looking at a pilot area in Western Washington where there would be enough forests that have committed, enough land of forest landowners who have committed to longer rotation ages so that a mill could be sited that will handle bigger trees. Okay. And so then the rotation age becomes like 85, 30 years. And the basic concept here is get the age at 85 years, okay, on the rotation age, log those stands in such a way that you're creating, you're not just clear cutting them, you're at least patch cutting or doing other kinds of cuts where you've still got enough big old trees retained so that the next 85-year rotation, you also may be able to take some trees out that are like 135 years. Because, if you look at this in just market terms, what do forests in the Northwest do better than any forest anywhere else in the world? It's not speed of growth. You can grow a plantation down in Georgia and more wood fiber on a short rotation, much better than you can in the Northwest. You got flat land, you got, it's warm, right? But what you can do in the Northwest that you can't do anywhere else in the world is grow these huge trees that produce just the best wood in the world.
Right. But you can't get the quality of the wood if you don't allow the trees to grow. And from a logging and market standpoint, and from an ecological standpoint, you also don't get the ecological functioning benefits if you don't allow the trees to grow to that size.
Right. And, it's kind of a happy coincidence here because the larger the trees get here, or you get these stands to start resembling natural old growth forests. the more ecological benefit you have and the more valuable the forest is, not just in wood, but in these other products like carbon sequestration, salmon, wildlife, all those kind of things. And most of those are marketable in one way or another. You can really assign a market value to just about all those things. The problem is, how does the market value get back to the forest landowner? Somebody may own some forest that's crucial for, retaining, for thermal regulation of water, for temperature regulation of water in a salmon stream. But they don't get any benefit from that.
Well, they get benefit, just not economic benefit.
Yeah. Okay. But you see, this is one of the problems with the modern economic system.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not true. I have to say right now, that's not just true in our capitalist economies, but it's also pretty much true in most of the so-called socialist economies, whether you're talking about the Western socialist, the Nordic states, or the fourth Russian Empire, or that's kind of the concept. Now, in the meantime, where is wood going to come from for the existing market, and also so that these at least large industrial companies don't go belly up? Because whether you think they should go belly up or not, the reality is they are players in this game. And the more you can come up with a solution that makes everybody happy, the more likely you are to get it implemented. You know, there may not be any such solution, but, you ought to at least just look. So.
Right. Well, this is interesting because to me, just going back to the very beginning of the conversation about first logging implements and strategies, it seemed like what is actually, in terms of the balance of having people log the land and also maintain ecosystem function, that in the beginning, when the tools were more rudimentary and it took a greater amount of effort, that the loggers were kind of naturally doing what was best for the land because they couldn't take as many trees all at once in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, until steam donkeys came in, it was real
right. But initially, they were coexisting with the landscape, and they were utilizing the resource without, totally destroying the forest ecosystem. It was
now it still wasn't, sustainable, quote unquote, as the indigenous peoples did.
No.
Where, you split cedar planks out of the side of a large cedar tree. The tree growing would stay alive.
They wouldn't cut the tree at all, right? They would, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the most sustainable. Yeah.
In the meantime, where does the wood come from? Where do the jobs come from for people who are, working in the industry? Well, it is less and less, of course. If you drew a curve of timber industry employment since the 1980s, really since the 1960s, it's kind of been steadily downward line. And that's really not because of spotted owls or regulation. That's mostly because of automation. Automation in the mills, improved equipment for the logging. Back when Trillium in 1987, I guess 88, came to Whidbey Island, the first place they logged was that 80 acres outside of Langley.
Now it's
40 acres outside of Langley, and they did it with a feller buncher, which is a big thing that just snips the tree off, grabs it, snips the tree off, flips it on its side, takes it to another machine that strips the branches. Got two people running two machines there, as opposed to a bunch of guys with chainsaws, going up down the tree, limbing it and all that stuff. So, I mean, that's really where the jobs have gone in the industry. But nations need an immense amount of work if they are going to survive climate change. You can see this in the Oregon Coast Range. There's a huge area of Douglas fir plantations that have been hit by Swiss needle cast. It's a disease And because they're monocultures and because these plantations weren't thin, the trees are all stressed. And so it's just like those trees are gone. I mean, they're dying by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions.
Mm-hmm.
So all these plantations need a lot of work in thinning, in creating new stand characteristics instead of these even-aged monocultures, in terms of getting more species into them. If you have hardwoods, if you have areas of hardwoods, maple, alder, those trees don't burn as well on fire.
Mm-hmm.
They need fire resistance. They hold more water.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we need to start making the landscape healthier in that way too, or we're going to be having, huge mega fires like they have in California now. So that's where the idea is. That's where, the shift would happen. Wood for the next, 40 years would be coming out of these plantations while they get improved. Mm-hmm. In an ecological and really an economic sense. Mm-hmm. And the existing older forests that would be logged now because they're 65 years old or they're even 85 years old, like some of the legacy forests, would be allowed to keep growing with maybe some light touch work on them. And that's kind of the concept. Problem is here, how do you put this all together considering the disparate interests, the disparate ownerships, that odd European concept, and market demand and the demand for returns now. Because of course, if I can cut a forest now and invest that money, even if I could have made twice as much by waiting another 40 years,
Well, but that's just a matter of thinking about perspective, because if you relate it to the stock market, people invest in mutual funds for, long periods of time with a lower return because of the stability of that return, whereas other people are out here like, quote, shorting the market to try to have big gains, but it doesn't have the same long-term kind of sustainable impact.
But if you look at, here you go back to the 80s, but really liquidation of capitalism, if you want to call it that, came into forestry in a big way in the 1980s with Plum Creek timber over in Montana. Plum Creek got taken over by some guys who were capitalist savvy, and they said, look, we liquidate all our trees. Now we have this big pile of money that we can do lots of things with, like pay ourselves bonuses,
right,
or invest elsewhere.
Right.
And so that happened in Montana, and that's really what Plum Creek did in Washington to their timberlands.
Right.
And that in turn put financial pressure on these other timber companies who until then had kind of been stick in the mud, we manage for the long term and all. There's, I can't think of any large scale, big, forest industrial company now that I think you can say really does that. There are some smaller ones that do that. They're mostly Hampton Lumber's an example. They're, FSC certified. Let's see, SFC, Sustainable Forestry Council.
Yeah. It kind of makes me feel like the idea of liquidating forests is like a horrible phrase and really gross.
It's a whole industries. I mean, it's happened to whole industries. Let's, these workers, well, let's see. Hey guys, that was a very good job you did. Here's a 20% budget, but you need to increase production by 30%. You did it great. Here's your new reward for that. You're gone. We're liquidating. We're moving the plant to Mexico.
Hey, think about logging New England and then the Midwest.
Yeah, it's a classic problem that goes, right back to the pioneering mining mentality.
Yeah.
New England was stripped. Then, the Midwest, then the Northwest. They're working on Siberia and the Canadian taiga. British Columbia is about at the point now where, we're just about running out of stuff we can mine.
Mm.
The boreal forest, that's still what's happening there. Certainly in tropical forests, that's what's happening.
Yeah. So, why isn't it regulated or considered the same as like dumping toxic waste? Because to me, liquidating forest land is just as impactful in a negative way as like chemical dumping.
The externalities are enormous and negative. Yes.
Part 2 will dive into forest practices in Island County and the loophole Marianne has discovered in the permitting process. Stay tuned.
Another man up in the pulpit in the state house. Head of the table with a black pen, scratching egos, talking too loud. Externalize every outcome, every warm gun, every profit. And kneeling down to the flashing numbers, the NASDAQ, the cold constructs. Running backwards, so just keep moving, just keep moving, just keep moving. Unlearning every lesson that our mothers tried to teach us.
This podcast is a production of the Whidbey Environmental Action Network and is made possible by our generous donors. Produced, edited, and mixed by me, Amanda Bullis. Special thanks to Marianne and Steve for their years of service through action and for lending their voices to this podcast. To WEAN's Executive Director, Marnie Jackson, and our board for their leadership. Special thanks to Whidbey musician and WEAN board member Nathaniel Talbot for letting us use his track Intuition from the album Animal, available on Bandcamp.
Every day on your paycheck, a volume of confidence against the idea of your body being put into your own hands. So please don't hold it, please don't hold it, please don't hold it back. Unleash the power, the straight logic of compassion. What I need now ain't that old religion or the cold hard facts. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Just need a woman's intuition, get us on track. Stepping out of the shadow of a false man's allegory, slowly erasing that old violence from the story. Recoupling emotion, slow emotion to intelligence, granting the planters, healers, teachers, feelers a new relevance. What I need now ain't that old religion or the cold